নিবিড় আধারে মাতর চমকে রূপ রাশি নিবিড় আধারে মাতর চমকে রূপ রাশি তাই যোগী ধ্যান ধরে ভোজে গিরি গুহাবাসী নিবিড় আধারে মাতর চমকে রূপ রাশি তাই যোগী ধ্যান ধরে ভোজে গিরি গুহাবাসী নিবিড় আধারে মাতর চমকে রূপ রাশি নিবিড় আধারে।
Swamiji was born as Narendranath Datta, the eldest son of attorney Vishwanath Datta and his wife Bhuvaneshwari Devi. On Makar Sankranti day, when Hindus offer rituals and worship to their holy river Ganges, Narendranath showed religious and leadership qualities from childhood. During his college days, he came into close contact with Sri Ramakrishna. The God-mad priest, spiritual teacher and mystic, residing at the Kali temple of Dakshineshwar, a few miles north of Calcutta. In due course, Ramakrishna's admirers formed a brotherhood. A few of the mostly unmarried young disciples were chosen by Ramakrishna to form a new order of monks headed by Narendra. Ramakrishna loved Naren very much and transmitted his spiritual powers to him a few days before his passing. Afterwards, the young men moved into their new monastery, a dilapidated building, and lived in poverty. A few years later, these young men took formal monastic names. Naren took the name Swami Vivekananda. The brother disciples made occasional journeys by train, bullock cart, and foot to various places in India as wandering monks. The combination of his spoken English, rhetorical fairy talk, devotional songs, and scriptural knowledge prompted others to suggest that he should represent Hinduism at the forthcoming Parliament of Religions in Chicago in the summer of 1893. With the blessings of Sri Sarada Devi, Ramakrishna's widow, Swamiji sailed for America. Via China and Japan, Swamiji first reached Vancouver and then reached Chicago around July 30 by train. The huge World's Columbian Exposition was already in progress for 3 months. He must have approached the Information Bureau at this administration building. To his dismay, he was told that delegates to the parliament would require credentials, and he had none. Second, it was too late to register as a delegate. Third, the parliament was to begin in the first week of September. In view of his small purse and the exorbitant daily expenses at Chicago, someone advised him to leave for Boston, where living was cheaper. On the train to Boston, Swamiji met an old wealthy lady, Catherine Sanborn, who cordially invited him to stay in her farm some 25 miles west of Boston. A few weeks later, on August 25, Swamiji went to Boston with Franklin Sanborn, a cousin of Catherine Sanborn. Swamiji then spent a weekend with Professor John Henry Wright of Harvard University at Annisquam, a resort some 40 miles northeast of Boston. Professor Wright was very impressed with Swamiji's learning and wrote a recommendation letter on his behalf. Professor Wright also bought Swamiji's rail ticket to Chicago, where he reached on September 8 or 9 evening 1893. He had mislaid the address of the committee in charge of the delegates to the Parliament of Religions. He spent the night in a huge empty wagon in the railroad freight yard, Chicago. The next morning he knocked at several doors for food and was rudely treated by the servants. He walked for 2 miles and finally sat down on Dearborn Street, resigning fate to Providence. Shortly, a stately lady, Mrs. George W. Hale, came out of her house and approached Swamiji, saying, "Sir, are you a delegate to the Parliament of Religions?" She took him into her house and gave him breakfast. Later, she took him to the office where Swamiji could register as a delegate. Of the old houses from that era still stand, although Mrs. Hale's house has been demolished. The Hale family was to become the dearest of all families that came to know him in America. The structures of the World's Fair were derived from classical prototypes and were arranged nicely on Jackson Park and Midway plazas in South Chicago on Lake Michigan. The chief wonder of the 1893 fair was the Ferris wheel, which had 36 cars, and sightseers were elevated 250 feet above ground. It earned its entire cost on September 1 and even forwarded money on the profits to the fair. Their fair included exhibit buildings for all the states of America as well as for many foreign countries. A replica of Cairo Street, a Persian palace with dancing girls, a Japanese temple, a Chinese theater, and a beauty contest were all part of the 1893 exposition. A new Liberty Bell became the most popular souvenir of the fair. There was even an exhibit building for India where metalwares, clothes, and other expensive items were sold. It was crowded with visitors who sipped tea. The Parliament of Religions was a small part of the World's Fair. Neither the official US government report on the fair, which discusses everything from architecture to Yom Kippur, nor a pictorial book of the World's Fair even mention the religious congress. While the fair went on for 6 months from May to October, the Parliament of Religions was for 17 days and was held at the Art Institute on Michigan Avenue. The Art Institute was also physically separated from the fairgrounds and 8 miles north of it in central Chicago. Due to its location in central Chicago, the Art Institute was closer to the various newspaper buildings compared to the fair and received attention from the press. The Parliament provided a variation to the fair which was already 4 months old, and this was the first time that the representatives of the world's great religions were gathered in one place. The Parliament was conceived by Mr. Charles C. Bonney, who wrote, within quotes, "If the great religious faiths can be brought into relations of friendly intercourse, many points of sympathy can be found, and the unity of mankind in the love of God and service to man be greatly facilitated." It is likely that Swamiji picked up this phrase, love of God and service to man, from his Parliament days. In the 17 days of the Parliament, many speeches were made by religious dignitaries from many corners of the world. There were other speakers from India besides Swamiji. Other speakers from India. Swamiji is known to have addressed the Parliament at least 6 times. His first address was on the afternoon of the opening day, September 11. While other speakers read from prepared speeches, he spoke impromptu, and partly because of his youth and handsome features, and partly due to his short and spirited delivery, received thunderous applause. He thanked his audience, the organizers, and other speakers in the name of millions of fellow Hindus. Swamiji said he was proud to belong to Hinduism, which taught universal acceptance of all religions, and he was proud to belong to India, which sheltered the persecuted refugees of all religions. He then quoted a Sanskrit hymn as the different streams having their sources in different places all mingle in the sea, O Lord, so the different paths which men take through different tendencies, crooked or straight, all lead to Thee. He ended his speech with a plea to end sectarianism, bigotry, and fanaticism. The newspapers of the next day carried some reports of his speech. Mary Louis Burke had to construct his full speech by going through 4 different papers, as no paper reported the full version. Further, no Chicago newspaper gave him front page coverage. Swami Nikhilananda has claimed in his biography that Swamiji spoke about a dozen times at the Parliament, but only 6 of them were ever found. The official report of the Parliament records the text of only 5 speeches by him, leaving out the text of the Buddhism speech. 2 of the speeches are really short. One of these 2 seems like a rejoinder to someone else's speech and not a speech by itself. The longest speech he made was a paper on Hinduism read on September 19. In it, he discussed Hindu metaphysics, psychology, and theology, the divinity of the soul, the oneness of existence, the non-duality of the Godhead, and the harmony of religions were the recurring themes in this paper. The biographers, including Nikhilananda, have circulated that Swamiji's life-size portraits were posted in Chicago streets after the Parliament. Well, nothing like that happened. The other speakers from India also made quite good speeches. Nagarkar, Modi, a paper on Hinduism by Professor Monilal Dwivedi, read by Veerchand Gandhi, seems a better paper, a more scholarly one compared to Swamiji's. But Dwivedi could not attend the Parliament, and therefore it was read by someone else. Even a Christian missionary from India, T.E. Slater of Bangalore, in his paper presented a quite informed view of Hinduism and India. It is nonsense to claim, as Nikhilananda and other Ramakrishna mission followers want, that, within quotations, whereas all else that was said and discussed at the Parliament has been forgotten, what Vivekananda preached is still cherished in America. End of quote. Barrow's official report on the Parliament of Religions has been used a lot in the last 10 years from the Rice University Library. Rice University Library The library has the complete works of Swami Vivekananda. These 8 volumes have been borrowed only about 4 times in 10 years, and most of those borrowings were by myself. Thus, Nikhilananda's remark that only Swamiji's works are being read is just not true. That is true for followers, but not for other people. Several papers praised Swamiji during and after the Parliament. The official report of the Parliament recorded that several of the participants were irritated by Swamiji's remarks on the closing day of the Parliament. Swamiji had come to America to seek funds for establishing a technical institute for people in India, and by now realized how difficult it was to get help for heathens in a Christian land. He lingered in Chicago for 2 more months after the Parliament. Lecturing almost every day in Chicago and adjoining cities, at the same time studying American society and its institutions. Swamiji wanted to raise money for his Indian project by lecturing and signed a 3-year contract with the Slayton Lyceum Lecture Bureau, an agency that would organize his tours in many American cities. These lecture tours took him to Madison, Wisconsin, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Des Moines, Iowa, Memphis, Tennessee, and Detroit, Michigan. Swamiji went to all these cities with Chicago as his base. He lived with the Hale family during most of his Chicago days. He wrote a letter to his brother disciple Shashi. I shall tell you something of the Hales, to whose address you direct my letters. They are an old couple having 2 daughters, 2 nieces, and 1 son. The son lives away from home and earns a living. The daughters live at home. All 4 are young and not married. The 2 daughters are blondes, while the 2 nieces are brunettes. The girls call me brother, and I address Mrs. Hale as mother. All my things are at their place, and they look after them wherever I go. In this, Swamiji spoke on November 26 at the First Unitarian Church. He criticized many Christians for practicing shopkeeping religion. They were always begging of God, "Oh God, give me this and give me that. Oh God, do this and do that." The Hindu could not understand this. He said, "You have your places for the worship of God, and you attend them once a week. But how few go to worship God. It is the fashion in the West to attend church, and many of you attend for no other reason. Have you then, you people of the West, any right to lay exclusive claim to take possession of God? tremendous applause at this point. We of the Hindu faith believe in worshipping God for love's sake, not for what He gives us, but because God is love, and no nation, no people, no religion has God until it is willing to worship Him for love's sake. You of the West are practical in business, practical in great inventions, but we of the East are practical in religion. In January 1894, Swamiji went to Memphis, Tennessee on a lecture tour. During an interview, he was asked why Hinduism has not elevated India among the nations of the world. He replied, "Because that is not the sphere of religion," replied Swamiji. "My people are the most moral in the world, or quite as much as any other race. They are more considerate of their fellow man's rights and even those of dumb animals. But they are not materialists. No religion has ever advanced the thought or inspiration of a nation or people. In fact, no great achievement has ever been attained in the history of the world that religion has not retarded." Some of his talks at Memphis were reported by the Memphis Commercial and Appeal Avalanche, and here is a picture of that newspaper building. In reply to another question at Memphis, he commented, "You Americans worship what? The dollar. In the mad rush for gold, you forget the spiritual until you have become a nation of materialists." His American listeners were startled by many of his vitriolic comments. If we study his Midwestern tours, we find that he left no stone unturned in order to defend Hinduism and India before his audiences. At the time, Americans mostly knew about India from her own Christian missionaries who went to serve in Indian missions. These missionaries often exaggerated the plight of Indians and denigrated their customs with a view to gather money for their work. In addition, the political dominion of India by the British cast a dark shadow on the Indian people. Therefore, when Swamiji went around these Midwestern towns, many a Christian missionary became alarmed at his success. A clash was imminent, and it reached a climax at Detroit, where he visited in February 1894. In Detroit, Swamiji was guest of Mrs. John J. Bagley, widow of an ex-governor of Michigan. In the 1890s, it was a city where both conservative and liberal thought found expression. Many of his lectures in Detroit were delivered at the Unitarian Church. In his first lecture, Swamiji said India is head and shoulders above United States and any other country. The Detroit Tribune reported, in his worship, the Hindu performs 5 ceremonies, worship of God, of his forefathers, of the poor, of the dumb animals, and of learning. As long as a Hindu has anything in the house, the guest must never want. Swamiji's eloquence held the church in rapt attention, often punctuated by applause. Bishop W.X. Ninde, who introduced Swamiji at the church, wrote a letter to the press saying Swamiji wanted to magnify the virtues of Hindus and discount the morals of the Christian lands. After Ninde's letters, there was a flurry of letters in the press, some supporting Swamiji and others supporting Ninde. Swamiji delivered 3 more lectures at this church on Hindu philosophy, the divinity of man, and love. They were all well attended. These are some original reports in the Detroit Journal, which reported if Vivekananda could be induced to remain a week longer, the largest hall in Detroit would not be able to hold the crowds which would be anxious to hear him. He has become a veritable fad. And these are some letters from original newspapers as microfiche. After his 4th lecture in Detroit, Swamiji left for Ohio, but the letters for and against him continued in the local press. Swamiji had succeeded in casting doubts in American minds about the missionaries' tales. The Orthodox ministers in Detroit and surrounding areas were perturbed by this exposure and wrote many letters in desperation to the Detroit press. After an absence of about 2 weeks, Swamiji returned to Detroit, and on March 9, he spoke at the Detroit Opera House and countered all the criticisms in a lecture titled Christian Missions in India. On this visit, Swamiji stayed a few days with businessman and ex-senator Mr. Thomas W. Palmer, and then returned to the Bagley residence. Swamiji gave a few more talks at the Opera House and at various parlors. After these lectures, there were many letters in the Detroit press. Henceforth, the Christian ministers refrained from large-scale denouncing of Hinduism and India from their pulpits. In general, Swamiji gained the sympathy of the liberal-minded people. He would visit Detroit 2 more times, once in March 1896 and again in July 1899. On these occasions, Swamiji conducted classes for interested people. In America, Swamiji had to travel many times by train. Most of the trains at the time had Pullman-type cars which had plush interiors, facilities for dining and wining or relaxing in tourist sleeper cars. Some of the trains even had manicure facilities, but most of them would have a barber shop and washrooms. Sightseeing was afforded by the so-called baggage buffet cars, and some of the trains had the so-called Wagner sleeper cars, which were more ornate compared to the Pullman variety. Swamiji took the train from Detroit to New York. In New York, Swamiji initially stayed with Dr. Egbert Guernsey and family. His first public speech in town was at the Waldorf Hotel on India and Hinduism, briefly reported in the New York Daily Tribune. The Waldorf Hotel. Swamiji gave many parlor talks in New York. Some of these were at the home of Miss Mary Phillips at 19 West 38th Street, which is right here. There is a jewelry shop at present. He met Miss Emma Thursby, the famous retired singer, and Leon Landsberg, who became his monastic disciple. Swamiji spent the summer of 1894 in Massachusetts, Chicago, Greenacre, and other resorts. In Boston, he was guest of Mrs. Sarah C. Bull, Miss Thursby's friend, made a trip to Baltimore and returned to New York in November, when he started the Vedanta Society in New York. He gave 4 public lectures at the Pouch Mansion 430. Swamiji gave 4 public lectures in Brooklyn at the Pouch Mansion 435 Clinton Avenue, Brooklyn, sponsored by the Brooklyn Ethical Association, where he drew packed crowds of about 800. Compared to Manhattan, Brooklyn papers gave him greater coverage. A big controversy arose as supporters of Pandita Ramabai gave statements to the press opposing the Swami. Dr. Louis Janes, president of the Ethical Association, supported Swamiji by his letters to the press. Swamiji initially came to America to seek funds for his technical college in India. Until the spring of 1895, his lectures were primarily concerned with explaining India, preaching religious tolerance, and teaching compassion through emphasis on Buddha. Swamiji had enough of lecture tours and now wanted to settle down in Manhattan independently of his patrons. He moved into a house in this area near the current Empire State Building at 54 West 33rd Street with Mr. Landsberg. It was a narrow brick house with a brownstone front. Swamiji wanted to have a band of serious students and began teaching classes. The first class on January 28, 1895 had only 3 or 4 students. The classes grew in size rapidly, and Miss Josephine MacLeod and her widowed sister Betty Sturgis joined the class about this time. At the same time, Swamiji was speaking at parlor lectures at Mrs. Charles Oyle's residence in Brooklyn, at Miss Thursby's apartment in Gramercy Park, which we see here. This is Gramercy Park. This is probably the building where Miss Thursby used to reside 34 Gramercy Park. The entrance. Swamiji probably delivered many lectures here to his intimate disciples. Swamiji also gave parlor talks at the Guernsey's home on Fifth Avenue. Guernsey home site on Fifth Avenue. He returned to his spiritually austere life of study and meditation, met many people through private interviews. He wrote to Alasinga, "Now I have got a hold on New York, and I hope to get a permanent body of workers who will carry on the work when I leave the country. Of course, financially it is a failure, but men are more valuable than all the wealth of the world." New York was getting hotter, and Swamiji wanted to escape to a cooler place. Mary Elizabeth Dutcher, one of his students, offered him a cottage at Thousand Island Park. Swamiji arrived here on Tuesday, June 18, 1895, by steamer from Clayton. There were thousands of other similar cottages on the island which had a summertime population of around 10,000. Here, Swamiji ate vegetarian food and slept a great deal. He slept 2 hours during the day and the whole night very soundly. He also wrote and read a little and held a class every day after breakfast. In a letter he wrote that he was enjoying the scenery, reading Sanskrit books, and talking endlessly about God and soul. This is the Vivekananda cottage, originally donated by Miss Dutcher at the Thousand Island Park. On June 19, there were only 3 or 4 students, but in a few more days there were 12 of them. Vivekananda cottage at Thousand Island Park. The best record of Swamiji's classes at Thousand Island Park is the book Inspired Talks. Out of class notes of Sarah Ellen Waldo and was edited later by Sister Devamata. We will read a few sentences from this book. June 23. We are striving to be and nothing more. There will not even be I, just pure crystal, reflecting all, but itself ever the same. When that state is reached, there is no more doing. The body becomes a mere mechanism without trying for purity. It cannot be impure. June 25. My master used to say, all is God, but tiger God is to be shunned. All is water, but avoid dirty water for drinking. June 27. Knowing is only relative. We can be God, but never know Him. Knowledge is a lower state. June 28. Be thankful to food. it is Brahman. The universal energy of Brahman is transmitted into our individual energy and helps us in all that we do. July 27. Brahman permeates the universe as butter permeates milk, but friction makes it manifest in one particular place. As churning brings out butter, so dhyana leads to the realization of Brahman in the soul. July 16. The books cannot teach you God, but they can destroy ignorance. Their action is negative. July 20. It is impossible to find God outside ourselves. Our own souls contribute all the divinity that is outside us. We are the greatest temple. Probably on July 23, Swamiji wrote his famous poem, The Song of the Sannyasin.
Say, and cause must bring the sure effect. Good, good. Bad, bad. And none escape the law. But whoso wears a form must wear the chain. Too true. But far beyond both name and form is Atman, ever free. Know thou art that, Sannyasin bold. Say, Om Tat Sat, Om. They know not truth, who dream such vacant dreams as father, mother, children, wife, and friend. The sexless self, whose father he, whose child, whose friend, whose foe is he who is but one. The self is all in all, none else exist. And thou art that, Sannyasin bold. Say, Om Tat Sat, Om. There is but one, the free, the knower, self. Without a name, without a form or stay. In him is Maya, dreaming all this dream. The witness, he appears as nature, so. Know thou art that, Sannyasin bold. Say, Om Tat Sat, Om. Where seekest thou that freedom, friend, this world nor that can give? In books and temples vain thy search. Thine only is the hand that holds a rope that drags thee on. Then cease lament. Let go thy hold, Sannyasin bold. Say, Om Tat Sat, Om.
July 29. Man is the greatest being that ever can be. The highest worship is to worship a man like Krishna, Buddha, or Christ. July 30. Tell the truth boldly whether it hurts or not. August 1. To whom can you do good when you see only God? You cannot do good to God. August 3. Give up mentally if you cannot physically. Give up from your heart of hearts. Have vairagya, renunciation. August 4. Value nothing material and do not cling to anything. If you cling to nothing, not even to life, then there will be no fear. The classes came to an end on August 6. Swamiji initiated two of his Western disciples into sannyasa during this period. They were Abhayananda, whose name was Mary Louis, and Kripananda, who was Leon Landsberg. He took a special liking to the ladies from Detroit, Sister Christine and Mary Funky. They and all other students received initiation into the vows of Brahmacharya. All of them put up in this small cottage and obviously put up with some inconveniences. Preparations for midday meals ensued after each morning class. On some days, Swamiji would cook a dish for them. They would share jokes and stories, but the disciples had to receive shocks now and then, goading them towards spiritual freedom and broadening their mental horizons. He kept a close watch on how the disciples were doing. In the afternoons, Swamiji took rest or went for walks in the island. The teachings during the day continued after dinner when disciples eagerly sat with him in the second floor veranda. As it used to be dark, no notes were taken. He would sometimes go into a soliloquy, sometimes share his plans of the Indian work, or else facets about spiritual life. The listeners would become unaware of the passage of time. At other times, he would become silent, meditate, and the disciples would leave one by one, knowing he is not inclined to talk any more. Swamiji thus trained his intimate disciples in Vedanta. His foremost concern was to show them the path to freedom. This Thousand Island Park Chapel is an old building from the time when Swami Vivekananda came here, 1895. It also includes a post office, some other shops, and a grocery store. Wesley Hotel was built a few years after Swamiji came here. Here once stood the Colombian Hotel, which was devastated in a fire, and this is the Thousand Island grocery store. Site of the Colombian Hotel, which was burned down. The park also has a library and a children's playground next to it. On the last day at the park, August 6, 1895, he was walking through the nearby woods and finally sat down to meditate under a tree, this tree. He became still and according to Mary Funky was unperturbed by pouring rain. Devotees speculate he had Nirvikalpa Samadhi here, under this tree. He left the park by steamer that night and took the train to New York City. Shortly after his return to New York City from Thousand Islands, Swamiji went to Europe. Swamiji went to stay with Kripananda in a rented house at 228 West 39th Street. This was to be Swamiji's busiest and most productive season in the West. He gave 8 classes a week and the classes swelled. This is a fabrics district of New York City right now. Miss Sarah Ellen Waldo used to come in from Brooklyn and do the cooking and household work. Another acquisition around this time for Swamiji was J. Goodwin, who has left us the most wonderful records of his lectures. Our 1895 classes resulted in 3 yoga books, Karma, Bhakti and Raja. In addition, Swamiji delivered many public lectures both in Manhattan and in Brooklyn in January of 1896. In his first public lecture at Hardman Hall, Swamiji said, "Religion is a question of being and becoming, not believing, but voluntary donations were accepted." Of his public lectures were commented on by the New York press. His last series of public lectures in New York was held at the Madison Square Garden. Here he said, "There is then but one unit existence, and that one is appearing as manifold. This self or soul or substance is all that exists in the universe." With this last lecture here on Sri Ramakrishna ended an intensely busy season of Swamiji. He totaled 70 classes, 10 public lectures, correspondence, interviews, initiations, writings, translations, and editing his own lectures. Swamiji spent about 2 weeks in Detroit after this busy season in early March before going to Boston. Madison Square Park. Swamiji liked the famous French actress Sarah Bernhardt's performance, where they reportedly delighted each other. But a perusal of some 10 biographies of Bernhardt failed to find a single mention of Swamiji, bringing into doubt the extent of her admiration for him. Similarly, Nikola Tesla, the famous physicist, attended some of Swamiji's talks in New York, but Swamiji is never mentioned in Tesla's available biographies. As guest of Sarah C. Bull, Swamiji spoke 5 times before the Procopia Club, once at Harvard University and once at the 20th Century Club. Many of the Harvard professors heard his talk on Vedanta philosophy and were favorably impressed. Professor William James later remarked that Swamiji's oratory was wonderful. It has been circulated in his biographies that Swamiji was offered a chair in philosophy at Harvard following his lectures. But a recent inquiry, head of the department in 1993, Professor Thomas Scanlon, revealed that he, in his many years at the department, had never heard about such an offer made to Swami Vivekananda. Professor Scanlon says such an offer might have been made, but he or any of his colleagues don't know about it in 1993. The president of the Harvard University at the time, Charles W. Eliot wrote a letter to the Christian missionaries in Calcutta denying any substantial effect of Swami Vivekananda on America regarding converting large number of people from Christianity. This letter has been published by the Christian Literature Society of Madras, India. And this letter, together with the current head of the department's no knowledge about this situation, strongly points to the fact that such an offer might have never been made to Swami Vivekananda. It might be a fabrication by his admirers. Before leaving for London, Swamiji spent a few days with the Hale family in Chicago and New York, sailing on April 15, 1896 for London, bringing to an end his first visit to America. He would return to India after 8 months in Europe and would return to America almost 3 years later in 1899.
Of the Brahma Sutras are the basis of Vedanta in the body, so that we point out that there are certain elements in Western philosophy which are simply not accommodable in Indian thought. There are certain Western elements which indeed are part of the Indian thought, but they are not mainline. And there are elements in Western thought which damn well better become part of the Indian thought on the philosophical. The same with the other way around. There are certain elements in Indian thinking, like ahimsa and certain other things, psycho-experimental, which the West has to accept in order to survive, and is part of the acceptance. Whether they will be called philosophies or not, it's really, we're landing then in what I call vulgar semantics. Why does everything that's nice have to be called philosophy? So what the West must learn from India is yoga and psycho-experimental ways of being at ease with yourself and the universe. Because that the West has no input. Christianity does not have it, Judaism does not have it, Islam has it perhaps, after long symbiosis within, I think. But so that if you want to really be free in the Indian text, you have to go to India. You have to go to India. There are lots of Indians coming here and tell you these things, perfectly all right, okay? But as far as Indian philosophy goes, Anvikshik here, that means Indian technical philosophy, what will the Western philosopher say about it once he is faced with it and understands it, what he's going to say? Interesting. The same what the Indian pundit says about Western philosophy, but he's not going to cross it. Indian logic is not better than Western logic, it's different. Indian metaphysics is not better than Western metaphysics. Is Indian spirituality is certainly much better than Western spirituality, but it's not philosophy. Why do you insist on the term philosophy? It's something else. Okay? So you...
The Swami spent about 2.5 months resting at New York in the Ridgely Manor, home of the legates, and then came to Los Angeles after a week at Chicago with the Hales. An old photograph of the railway line which must have brought Swamiji into Los Angeles. He was received at the Los Angeles train station by Miss Josephine MacLeod. From the train station, they went to live with a Miss Spencer. Los Angeles was at that time the 26th largest city in the country and occupied only a tiny fraction of the area it does today. Modern Los Angeles.
तुझसे हमने दिल को लगाया, जो कुछ है तो तू ही है। तुझसे हमने दिल को लगाया, जो कुछ है तो तू ही है। एक तुझको अपना पाया, एक तुझको अपना पाया।
Talk. But when Swamiji arrived in December 1899, Los Angeles looked like this. It had, among modern amenities, electric car lines, electric lights and sewers. 2 electric cars running in the city from that period. The inhabitants were mostly prosperous and hardy farmers. This is a view of the nearby town of Pasadena in 1906, 6 years after Swamiji left Southern California. And this is a view of the same Colorado Boulevard in Pasadena only 22 years later in 1928. And this was after a heavy boom, as it is called. But this is how most of the area looked like in 1900. This is Blanchard Hall, an old photograph of it from 1900, the hall where Swamiji delivered his first public lecture in Los Angeles. 233 South Broadway. Here stands a vacant lot where once stood the Blanchard Hall, where Swamiji gave his first lecture in Los Angeles. Lecture in Los Angeles on Hindu religion and philosophy. The Los Angeles Times reported in part Swamiji said, Western civilization has sought a personal God and despaired at the loss of belief in such. But God cannot be known to the external senses. The infinite, the absolute cannot be grasped. Yet although it eludes us, we may not infer its non-existence. It exists. What is it that cannot be seen by the external eye? The eye itself. It may behold all other things, but itself it cannot mirror. This then is the solution. If God cannot be found by the outer senses, turn your eye inwards and find in yourself. The soul of souls. Man himself is the all. Western civilization has in vain endeavored to find a reason for altruism. Here it is. I am my brother, and his pain is mine. I cannot injure him without injuring myself. When I have realized that I myself am the Absolute, for me there is no more death, nor life, nor pain, nor pleasure, nor caste, nor sex. How can that which is absolute die or be born? Beginning December, Swamiji was living in the S.K. Blodgett's house at 921 21st Street, which is right here, this blue building with the dog, and after that he moved to South Pasadena. Beginning on the south side of downtown Los Angeles was Georgia Street, which has been gobbled up by the construction of this Los Angeles Convention Center, and at 1327 Georgia Street once stood the site of the Home of the Truth, and at this Home of Truth, beginning December 19, many talks of Swamiji were organized by the director, Mr. J.R. Bransby. The Los Angeles Home of Truth, Swamiji spoke mainly on concentration-related themes. Mr. J.R. Bransby, director of this church, wrote later, "There is combined in Swami Vivekananda the learning of a university president, the dignity of an archbishop, with the grace and winsomeness of a free child. Getting on the platform without a moment's preparation, he would soon be in the midst of his subject." Carrie, Alice, and Helen, three Mead sisters of South Pasadena, had heard Swamiji's talks from the beginning. After meeting him at Mrs. Blodgett's house, Mrs. Alice Hansbrough, the second Mead sister, organized a few talks for him in Los Angeles and Pasadena. With the MacLeod sisters, Swamiji went to the top of Mount Lau and stayed at Echo Mountain House, an elaborate hotel on the summit. Though the cyclonic monk brought no real cyclone with him, fire followed. The hotel went into flames only 3 weeks later. He is seen here riding this funicular which went up to the top of the Echo Mountain House. Swamiji also visited the Throop Polytechnic Institute, the forerunner of modern-day California Institute of Technology. This is California Institute of Technology in Pasadena. Swamiji was very much pleased with the Throop Institute and wanted to learn something for his proposed industrial schools in India. He also gave a talk at the Universalist Church, which was across the street from the Throop Institute. Swamiji moved into the Mead residence at 309 South Monterey Road in South Pasadena in January end 1900. It was acquired by the Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood and restored to its original state to a large extent. Here Swamiji lived for around 1 month and 3 weeks between January end and February end. The house was acquired for the Vedanta Society in 1959 by a devotee and donated to the society. The lower floor is a small entry door leading to a small hallway here with a living room to the left and a staircase leading to the upper floor to the right. The hallway leads to the dining room, which is the largest room in the house. We walk up the stairs. Is a small hallway in the upper floor and 3 bedrooms. The Mead household consisted of Mr. Mead, his 3 daughters, Alice's 4-year-old daughter Dorothy, and Carrie's 17-year-old son Ralph. Mr. Mead, who was 84 years old, slept in the dining room, and his grandson Ralph in the front bedroom on the upper floor. The 3 sisters slept in a large bedroom right here, and Swamiji got the small room at the back of the house, which has been now converted to a shrine inside Swamiji's bedroom, which is now a shrine. A view from Swamiji's bedroom looking up the hill. It is at the top of this hill that he ate lunch sometimes. There was a bathroom on the upper floor, and it has a door through which one can go into the attic, where Miss Fairbanks, the housekeeper, and Dorothy lived upstairs in the attic. The hosts were quite informal and allowed Swamiji a lot of freedom. Every morning after his bath, around 7 o'clock, Swamiji would descend downstairs in a bathrobe, his hair still wet from the bath, and walk in the garden or around the house. Breakfast was served around 7:30.
This is the original table that was here that Swamiji dined on, and it was taken over to Swami Prabhavananda by the Mead sister before she passed away.
As Ralph went to his school on week, and Helen Mead went to work in Los Angeles, after they left, Mr. Mead, Carrie, Alice, and Swamiji will have a leisurely chat during breakfast in this room. In January, when Swamiji had a morning class at 10 at the Pasadena Shakespeare Club, Alice accompanied him and Carrie sometimes. On other days, he would stroll some more outside